What's your creepiest true story that still gives you chills to this day? Story 1. When I was 6, 28 years ago, my mom and dad took me and my younger sister to a Major League Baseball game, leaving my grandmother to babysit my youngest sister. When we got back, my grandmother told my parents that two men had come by the house with photography equipment and asked whether a young girl with red curly hair lived there, saying they had spotted her and believed she would be a great child model for some advertising work they were doing. When my grandmother said she was not home, they said they would come back another time. My grandmother and mom did not think much about it, but my dad said that something was not right and called the police. 15 minutes later, several Federal Bureau of Investigation agents showed up and began conducting interviews with my grandmother and my parents while I ran around and showed the agents my Matchbox police helicopter. It turned out we had been targeted by a child theft ring. The photographers would take a bunch of photos and wait until the toddler threw a tantrum. Then they would ask the mother to go grab a toy to keep the child entertained. And while the mother was out of the room, they would grab the child and run, leaving everything else behind. The Federal Bureau of Investigation told my parents that my sister had already been sold and would have been out of the country within 24 hours if they had taken her. We were advised to change preschools and other aspects of our daily routine. It still gives me chills to think about what could have happened to her, and needless to say, my mom became very overprotective, and it was a few years before she even trusted us with a babysitter. Story 2. When my mom was young, she and her mother lived in a trailer in the backyard of a family member's house. My mom was about 12 at the time when a man in the neighboring house started staring at her from time to time. She got a creepy feeling from him, but figured he was just a harmless, lonely guy. One night when my mom was alone, she heard something on the roof of their trailer, then what sounded like footsteps slowly walking along the metal rooftop. Because they were very poor at the time, they did not have a phone, so she eventually ran out of the trailer and into the house without looking on the roof. When her uncle went outside to investigate, nothing was on the roof. A few weeks went by with no incidents, and my mom figured she must have just scared herself. More disturbing things would randomly happen, but only when she was alone, and they were always spaced out by a week or two. If I remember correctly, this went on for a couple of months before it stopped completely. Months passed without any strange incidents until one night my mom woke up to the trailer being unbelievably hot, and she could feel that the heater was on full blast. She got out of bed and was about to go to the heater control, but she was overcome with a bad feeling and decided to go into the house instead. Her uncle went out to the trailer and noticed that the lock on the door was broken or tampered with, and he quickly looked inside but did not see anything. His wife made him call the police, and when they arrived, they searched the trailer and found one of the kitchen knives hidden behind a chair next to the heating controller. They suspected that the neighbor had gone into the trailer, turned the heat up, and crouched behind the chair waiting for my mom to come by. It has been a long time since I heard the story, but from what I remember, the police questioned the neighbor, but could not really do anything. Luckily, my mom and grandmother were able to move out of that town shortly after. My mom later told me that about 5 years later, she was visiting other family in a nearby town and saw the neighbor at a grocery store, and she ran out before he noticed her. Story 3. My best friend and I were having a sleepover at her house when we were teenagers, and for some reason we were home alone. We were fooling around upstairs when we suddenly heard a loud crash downstairs. We panicked for about 30 minutes before we finally got the nerve to check it out, and I grabbed a bat as we slowly crept down the stairs. In the kitchen, we found that a glass bowl had fallen and shattered. But the really unsettling part was that all the broken pieces had been picked up and placed neatly into another bowl on the table, and we still have no idea how that happened. Another time with the same friend, we decided it would be fun to sleep outside in her parents' camper. And in the middle of the night, I woke up to the silhouette of a man standing in the doorway. He stood there for a moment and then walked out. I was still half asleep and wondering if it had really happened when I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, my friend told me about a dream she had where someone came into the camper, and that is when we both started to panic. Apparently someone, possibly a homeless person since she lived right next to the train tracks, had been sleeping there without anyone knowing. Story 4. When I was 15, my stepfather was stabbed right in front of me. There was an altercation in the middle of our street at 2 in the morning that woke everyone in our house. My stepfather and my uncle were still awake and drinking and went outside to see what was happening. There was a young man violently attacking one of our older neighbors, an alcoholic man who lived a few houses down from us, and we later found out that the young man was dating the older man's daughter. My stepfather and uncle went out to break it up, and during the chaos, my stepfather was stabbed by the young man. He stumbled back onto the porch and collapsed, and I tried to catch him as he fell, with his blood smearing down the front of my shirt. The younger man ran off and we called 911. We stayed at the hospital until early morning, and when my mom and I finally got home, there was a message on our answering machine. It was a friend of mine from school, crying and apologizing for calling in the middle of the night, but she said she had just had a dream where there was screaming, a fight, and I was covered in blood, and she begged me to call her back. The timestamp on the message matched the exact time of the stabbing. This was in the late 1980s, before computers and even cell phones were common, and I lived on the other side of town from her, so there was no way she could have known what had happened. Story 5. Just a few months ago, while I was still in school, I rented an old house with two of my friends. I lived in the basement while they each had a room upstairs, and several strange things happened to me while I was living down there. The first involved a dog I had just gotten who was about 4 months old at the time. Every now and then, right after I turned the television off to go to sleep, my dog would start whining and growling at one specific corner of my room. He normally never got on my bed because he was not allowed, but during those moments he would jump up and press himself as close to me as possible, never taking his eyes off that corner. This happened about 5 times over the course of 4 months. Then toward the end of the school year, when I was about to move out, the scariest thing that has ever happened to me occurred. Under our stairs there was a small door that led to a tight space with a dirt floor, and nailed to the inside of the door was a strange, old wooden piece that looked like part of a map, making it an already unsettling place. Up until the day before this incident, we had kept a small chair in front of that door, where I hung my coats and other things, but we had friends over the night before and moved the chair upstairs. It was dark, probably around 8 in the evening, and I had just been upstairs in the kitchen. As I stepped off the stairs and reached for the door to my room, the little door under the stairs began to open extremely slowly, making the loudest creaking sound I have ever heard. I stood frozen in place, staring at the doorway and waiting for whatever might come out, and I remained there for about 5 minutes, absolutely terrified. Eventually, I forced myself to open my bedroom door and lock it as quickly as I could. I was not sure if either of my roommates were home, so I called my female roommate and found out she was there, and I spent the rest of the night upstairs with her, too scared to go back down to the basement. I should mention that I was a 21-year-old man at the time, and not someone who scares easily. I know many people would say it was just the wind or movement from the stairs, just like my roommates suggested, but I have experienced things like that before, and only felt mildly unsettled, whereas this was different, because the moment I heard that door open and saw it moving so slowly, I felt overwhelming terror, as if there was someone or something else in the room that wanted me to notice it. Story 6. Well, I am late, but whatever. About 2 years ago, I was in my room reading a book when I heard it. Very soft at first. Two little girls giggling, and not just any giggle, but the kind you hear in horror movies. I immediately put my book down and listened closely, and after about a minute of holding my breath, I decided it must have come from outside. Then that night, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard it again. Two little girls giggling. And now it was 2 in the morning, and I was absolutely sure there were not two little girls outside my window at that time of night. So I started to panic. I sat up in my bed and waited for what felt like forever, just listening, and then I heard it again. I jumped out of my bed and spent the rest of the night in the guest room. By the next morning, I was convinced my room was haunted, and for the next week I avoided my room entirely and slept in the guest room without my family knowing. I was too afraid to tell anyone because I thought I was going crazy or that no one would believe me. But every time I spent more than an hour in my room, I would hear those two little girls giggling. By the end of the week, I was a complete mess, barely sleeping, and absolutely terrified of my room. Then one morning, my brother walked up to me and asked if I was deaf or something, which obviously confused me. And after I questioned him further, he told me about a small device he had hidden in my room. Apparently, it was a prank device that could be easily concealed and made a variety of sounds. And my brother had chosen the extremely creepy sound of little girls giggling. He wondered why I had not heard it or said anything all week, and I honestly wanted to punch him in the face. So my room was not haunted after all. And the moral of the story is that sometimes your brother is just a complete jerk. Story 7. The creepiest thing that has ever happened to me will always be the man who watched me through my window. There was nothing paranormal about it, but it was terrifying. I was texting my girlfriend and playing a game when I heard rustling outside my window. And for context, I live in the basement, which is set up like an apartment at my mom's house. I do not have any curtains, and when I turned off my music player, I could clearly see someone standing there staring at me. This went on for about 10 minutes. I texted my little sister to grab a bat and turn on the lights upstairs, and as soon as the lights came on, the man ran off. I have never felt more unsettled, except for something that happened more recently. One night I thought I imagined a strange rushing sound, followed by a dull impact noise in the middle of the night, and I brushed it off. The next morning my stepfather was cleaning the yard and found the air conditioning cover from the other window well lying in the yard. When I went upstairs to get ready to help wash my mom's car, they told me what they had found and asked if I had heard anything, so I explained what I remembered. Since then, I keep a knife and an aluminum bat nearby at all times. For anyone wondering why we have not called the police again, we did the first time, and they said they could not do anything. And unless someone actually breaks into the house, we are stuck dealing with this person, or possibly people, until that happens. As for people telling me I need to get a gun, I cannot legally have a firearm in the house because of the nature of my mental illness. And while I am stable now, everyone in my household and the state agreed it was best not to keep a gun here, so I stick with my knife and my bat, and a friend may let me use his air-powered pellet gun. Story 8. The creepiest thing I can remember ever happening to me did not involve anything paranormal. I was walking to the store late at night, probably sometime between 11 in the evening and 1 in the morning. I do not remember exactly, but the streets were completely empty. I live in the Bronx, in an area that is not considered very safe, but I grew up around the rougher people in the neighborhood and learned not to be constantly afraid because many of them actually look out for their neighbors, even if they are not kind to outsiders. As I was walking, everything was quiet until I heard footsteps behind me. And being cautious, I turned around and took a long look at the man so I could remember his face in case I ever needed to identify him later, which is a habit you develop growing up in an unsafe area. I am a short girl, about 5 feet 1 inch tall, and this man was nearly twice my height, which made me uneasy, but I kept walking and acted normal. After a while, he caught up to me and asked if I was Dominican, and I answered yes without stopping. Then he asked if I was 18, and at the time 3 years ago, I was only 17. So I said no and prepared to cross the street because he was making me uncomfortable. As soon as I said no, he looked disappointed, said never mind, and ran away. It was a small interaction, but it deeply unsettled me because I still think about what might have happened if I had told him I was 18 and what exactly he was planning to do. Story 9. My boyfriend works the night shift, and I was asleep alone in the house when I was woken up in the middle of the night by my puppy whining in the living room, and I assumed he needed to go outside. I was just about to open the back door when I heard a strange scratching and clicking sound coming from the front door, like someone was sticking something into the lock. I went to check and could see the silhouette of someone standing there through the window in the door. And then I noticed a second figure standing by the living room window, although it was too dark to make out any features. I knew they could see me because I did not have any blinds at the time, and they just stood there watching. I panicked and called the police, then called my dad, and I hid in the kitchen where I was out of sight of any windows while I waited for help to arrive. My parents live across town and got there before the police did, and by that point the people were gone, but the neighbors across the street were awake and had seen a car parked there. I stayed at my parents' house that night, and when I came back home the next morning, I noticed that a basement window had been partially kicked in. I had a security system installed the very next day, and I still have no idea who those people were. Story 10. This was a kidnapping attempt that happened in the 1980s. I was visiting a friend in a Sacramento neighborhood late at night when I was around 9 or 10 years old, and three of us decided to walk several blocks to play near a park in elementary school at around 10 in the evening. We were playing with a frisbee in the street in front of the school when it landed in the road just as a white van pulled up and stopped, as if to let us retrieve it. I walked toward the van, grabbed the frisbee, and stepped aside to let the van pass. But as it moved forward, the sliding door suddenly opened, and a man dressed entirely in black rushed out and tried to grab me. He was wearing a harness, and the van had been rigged with a telescoping mechanism that allowed him to extend several feet out of the vehicle while suspended, similar to effects used in haunted houses. And it was controlled by another person inside the van who was also dressed in black, meaning there were at least three people involved. I narrowly avoided being grabbed, and all three of us ran toward the school, jumped a fence about 6 feet tall, ran through bushes along the fence line, and then jumped a second fence that was roughly 15 feet high, which allowed us to get inside the school grounds. We were terrified and could hear the van driving around, assuming they were searching for us, and we eventually found a way to get onto the roof of the school from the inside. From there, we watched as the van slowly circled the school for at least 30 minutes, clearly trying to locate us, which made everything even more frightening because it felt like they did not want to leave witnesses behind. This was before cell phones, so we stayed hidden until about 45 minutes after we last saw them, and it even appeared that some of the people were searching on foot. Eventually, we made our way back to my friend's house and never told our families because we were afraid we would get in trouble. Story 11. This is not supernatural, just deeply unsettling human behavior. In the late 1990s, I went to a yard sale about 6 blocks from my house in a fairly small town and found a silver cigarette case that I thought would make me look stylish and sophisticated at the bar. I bought it for $2 from a man who was at least 85 years old, and when I took it home, I immediately dropped it on the sidewalk and dented one corner, but it still looked good enough to use. After a few trips out, it became inconvenient because it only held 8 cigarettes, so I tossed it into a nightstand drawer and forgot about it. A few months later, I noticed another yard sale at the same house and stopped by, and there I found a cigarette case identical to the one I had bought before. When I picked it up, I realized it had the same dented corner, and when I opened it, there was a cigarette inside that was the exact brand I smoked. For reasons I still cannot explain, I bought it again for $2 from the same elderly man, and when I got home, the original case was no longer in my nightstand drawer. I will never forget the unsettling smile that man gave me when I bought it the second time. Story 12. I am a woman, and I am 21 now, but this happened when I was 4 years old, just after my sister had turned 16 and gotten her driver's license. It was probably September, since she had received her license in July, and she was my half-sister from my father's first marriage, living with her mother and stepfather while I lived with our father and my mom about 30 minutes away. My dad worked late hours and my mom traveled frequently for work, so I spent a lot of time with babysitters until my sister got her license, and eventually my dad allowed her to pick me up from the babysitter after school and take me to her mom's house until he finished work, which she was incredibly excited about. Even though I was only 4, I remember this event vividly, and while I forgot some parts over the years, my sister later confirmed most of what I remembered and filled in the rest. One of the first times she was allowed to drive alone with me, a white pickup truck began swerving behind us shortly after we pulled onto the main road, and after several turns it was still following us, even mirroring her lane changes, with tires squealing as it aggressively stayed behind us. The man became increasingly hostile, honking repeatedly, swerving, pulling up beside us, and making threatening gestures. And although I do not remember his face clearly, I remember the expression of intense hatred on it. At a large 4-way stoplight, he pulled in front of us, blocked our car, got out, screamed at us, lifted his shirt to show he had a gun, and approached our vehicle, at which point my sister covered me, told me to close my eyes, and sped through the intersection to escape. He followed us to my house, blocked us into the driveway, got out again with the gun, and my sister had to drive across the lawn and back onto the road to get away. He continued following us, hitting our car with his truck and trying to force us toward heavy traffic, even making a throat-slitting gesture. until my sister finally pulled into a gas station and told me to unbuckle, jump out, and run inside to ask the cashier to call 911. I did exactly that, and she followed moments later. And although the man searched her car, he fled before police arrived. They never found him, and we never learned why he targeted us. But the only things missing from the car were my sister's identification card and the cash she had with her. Story 13. This did not happen to me, but it happened to my cousin and was witnessed by another cousin and my aunt. For the sake of the story, I will say my younger cousin's name is Jenny, my older cousin's name is Jane, and my aunt's name is Myra. Jenny and Myra were in New York City visiting Jane while she was in her master's program, and they spent time touring the city and staying at a hotel somewhere in Manhattan. In the middle of the night, Jenny started having intense nightmares, and after talking to her later, she described symptoms that matched sleep paralysis exactly. She said she felt like she was being pulled in and suffocated by a massive television that pushed her through the bed and into the ground. She woke up screaming and crying and ended up vomiting and wetting herself in the bathroom, and my Aunt Myra helped clean her up and calm her down. Sometime later, they both went back to bed. After a while, my aunt checked on Jenny and found her staring straight at her with a completely blank expression, still asleep but with her eyes fully open, which deeply unsettled her. At the same time, my aunt and my cousin Jane both reported hearing whispering and what sounded like children's voices. They left first thing in the morning, but the strangest part came later when they looked at a family photo taken at Serendipity, where Jenny's lips appeared completely black. They were not edited or altered in any way, but perfectly dark and symmetrical, almost as if she had applied black makeup or lipstick, which she had not. I have seen the photo myself, and to this day, none of us have any explanation for why her lips appeared that way. Story 14. My parents were on their honeymoon in Key West when this happened. When they arrived at the hotel to check in, they were told their room was non-smoking, and since my dad was a smoker, they asked for a different room. They were given a room change and headed up, but as soon as they stepped off the elevator, the smell of fresh paint was overwhelming. Down the hallway, there was a painter actively working with all his supplies laid out, painting the wall. My parents casually greeted him as they walked past, but he did not acknowledge them at all. When they reached their room, the smell of paint was even stronger, to the point where it was unbearable, so they went back to the front desk to request another room. When they explained the situation, the attendant looked confused and told them there was no scheduled painting on that floor that day, but still agreed to move them. My parents returned to the floor to collect their luggage, and within about 10 minutes the painter was completely gone, with all of his supplies cleaned up, and the smell of paint had vanished entirely. Although shaken, they went to their new room and tried to move on. The next morning, while heading to breakfast, they overheard a tour guide speaking to a group and mentioning the floor my parents were originally assigned. According to the guide, many years earlier, a painter had been working on that same floor, fell down the elevator shaft, and died. My parents are not people who normally believe in paranormal experiences, but after something they could not explain, it left them deeply unsettled. Story 15. I have two experiences that still bother me years later, but the one involving Pop-Tarts continues to resurface in my mind, especially when I wake up in the middle of the night. This happened when I was around 17 and had gotten home from work fairly late. I went straight to my room to change and realized I was hungry, and since it was probably around 1 in the morning, I did not want to cook or make noise and risk waking my parents. I went into the kitchen to look through the cupboards for a quick snack, and our kitchen had a door that led directly to the backyard. It was an old wooden door, but my dad had added a metal security gate on the outside with holes small enough to keep insects out, allowing us to leave the wooden door open during the summer for airflow. He had also installed a motion-activated security light that would turn on whenever movement was detected, usually only when I let my dog outside at night, though that night my dog was already in my room waiting for me. As I searched the cupboards, I finally found Pop-Tarts and decided to eat them right there, so my dog would not try to steal them. While standing there eating, I heard a faint whistling sound coming from outside, and at first I assumed it was the wind, but I quickly realized it was a distinct tune, sounding like part of a song that felt both happy and sad at the same time. After about 20 seconds, I tried to convince myself it was one of my friends messing with me from down the block, possibly hiding near the fence. But just as I thought that, the security light suddenly turned on. I scanned the yard and surrounding area but could not see anyone or anything that could have triggered it, and the whistling continued. I started to panic, frozen in place, wondering who could be out there, when suddenly the whistling grew louder and I saw the handle of the metal security door moving up and down as if someone were trying to open it. I could clearly see through the metal gate that no one was there, yet the handle kept moving and the whistling sounded like it was right outside the door. With the lights still on and nothing visible, I dropped the Pop-Tarts, ran back to my room, slammed and locked the door, and hid under the blankets with my bat and my dog. After that night, I never went into the kitchen late at night again. Story 16. When I was about 6 years old, I was playing with the kid next door one afternoon when the lights suddenly went out. We were alone at the house because all of her family members were at the hospital with her mom, who was suffering from leukemia at the time. When the blackout happened, my friend went outside onto the porch to do something I do not remember, and I stayed by the door looking outside until something made me turn back toward the house. In the living room, I saw a shadow figure walking around, tall and dark with no recognizable features at all, almost like someone wearing a black full bodysuit, but not as solid as a real person would be. It was not very blurry, and I could clearly see it moving around the room as if it were searching for something. I was not scared at first because I had never seen anything like it before and was more curious than anything else. The figure then moved up to the second floor, and I followed it, watching as it walked through a bedroom, still appearing to search. Eventually, it began moving toward the wall on my right, and I remember thinking in that moment that it was going to disappear, and then it did, passing straight through the wall and vanishing. I forgot about this entirely until I was around 17 years old, when I was watching one of those real ghost story television shows in Japan that air every summer before the Obon holidays. One man described seeing shadow figures in a hospital where he had been staying for several months, and he said he often noticed them near people who were about to die. Hearing that sent chills through my body, because I remembered that my friend's mom passed away about a week after I saw that shadow figure. And ever since then, I have wondered if what I saw was death itself, or whatever comes to collect someone when they are about to die. Story 17. My older sister has always been somewhat clairvoyant as long as I have known her, and she has often sensed things before they happened, including sudden deaths of friends and strange streaks of luck, sometimes warning us long in advance. At one point, she was living near an old hospital in Las Vegas and was walking home from the bus stop late at night after work when she realized something was following her. She described it as a dark, hulking shape about the size of a large Rottweiler, but hunched at the shoulders, and although it resembled an animal, it moved far too fast, darting from bush to bush along the neighboring yards while making a direct path toward her. As she hurried toward her house, it began laughing in a manic way, while also growling at the same time, and she noticed a strong smell of something rotten and sulfur-like, similar to rotten eggs. It followed her for nearly a quarter of a mile, shaking bushes beside her and trying to draw her attention, and even began making sounds as if it were speaking to her while laughing. Eventually, she stopped under a streetlight and shouted at it to leave her alone and stop following her, and at that point it paused, seemed confused, and began to grow slightly larger while growling again. A neighbor then came outside to go to work and witnessed my sister standing her ground, yelling at what he described as a very large and twisted dog, telling it that it would find no victim there and that its words had no power. The neighbor later told me that the creature tried one last time to approach her before turning and speeding away faster than anything he had ever seen, and he also mentioned noticing red eyes, although only after I asked him to repeat the story several times. About a week later, a boy in the neighborhood was arrested for killing his younger brother with a large hunting knife, and according to a newspaper article, he told police that a demon had been visiting his window every night and whispering to him to kill his family, describing it as a hunched animal that laughed and growled at the same time, just like what my sister encountered. Story 18. Once my father went camping in early spring at a non-commercial campground, the kind that is more secluded and usually has no camp manager or facilities. And because it was still cold, especially at night, there were very few people there. The only campers nearby were my dad, a few of his friends, and an old beat-up Chevrolet truck parked a few sites away with a makeshift camper attached to it. Wanting to be polite, my dad and a couple of the others went over to introduce themselves to the man staying there and let him know to speak up if they were being too loud during the weekend. The man seemed friendly enough, thanked them, and appeared to have been there for weeks with a clothesline set up and everything. Over the 3 nights they stayed, they waved to him occasionally and even invited him over for coffee one morning. But after not seeing or hearing from him for a couple of days, they assumed he was keeping to himself and finished their trip. As they were leaving the campground, they drove past his campsite and noticed everything was still set up exactly the way it had been before. My dad was driving toward the exit when a friend in the truck suddenly told him to stop because he thought he saw something, and my dad realized he had seen it too out of the corner of his eye, but initially thought it was just a trick of his mind. It was not, because the man was hanging from a tree, not a trash bag meant to keep animals out. They all got out and called 911 with poor reception, and the scene was deeply disturbing, with clear signs that the man had been there for some time. My dad later said there was a note attached to the tree with a large knife, but he was too shaken to read it and still talks about how badly he wanted to cut the man down, even though it was obvious he could not be helped. Police and emergency services eventually arrived, thanked them for reporting it, and sent them on their way after asking a few questions. What makes this story especially unsettling is that it happened at my dad's favorite campsite, the same one we were staying at when he finally told us about it years later, waiting until we were grown before sharing what he had seen. Story 19. My life is about as mundane as it gets, but this is what happened to me while working at a summer camp where counselors and campers stay overnight for a full week. I hated my assigned room because the bunk beds and walls felt too cramped, so I secretly started sleeping in the staff lounge instead. The staff lounge entrance had a simple electronic lock that required a 4-digit code to open, and I found the couches far more comfortable than my bed, making sleeping at camp much more enjoyable, at least until this one night. Because it was summer and the nights were usually warm where I lived, I did not need blankets as long as the ceiling fans were off, but that night I woke up shivering. Rather than panicking, I simply piled a few extra couch cushions on top of myself and tried to go back to sleep. As I started drifting off, I heard footsteps approaching the door, and there are about 5 steps leading up to it that creak even under the slightest pressure. I assumed someone was coming in for a late-night snack and began falling asleep again when I heard the error beep from the lock, signaling that the code had been entered incorrectly. I brushed it off, assuming someone had mistyped the last digit, but then it happened again, 4 beeps followed by another error sound. Slightly annoyed but still unconcerned, I started to sit up to call out the code when I froze after hearing another error beep. All of us counselors had the code memorized since we accessed the lounge frequently, and campers were heavily supervised at night, so it made no sense that someone could not enter it correctly. After the 5th failed attempt, the footsteps began moving away from the door, but what terrified me was how it happened. I listened closely and never heard breathing, nor the sound of carpet shifting as someone turned around, which meant whoever it was walked straight back down the steps in complete darkness, backward. The most frightening moment came after the footsteps stopped, when I heard a small voice rise slowly from the base of the steps toward the couch, too unnatural to belong to a real child. Seconds later, a deafening bang slammed into a nearby wall, causing me to scream and completely lose control in fear. No doors opened, no doors closed, and whoever had been there should still have been inside the building. So I sat frozen, wide-eyed and listening to every sound until dawn finally came. Story 20. My mother is mentally ill, and when I was 11 years old, I realized she was not just eccentric but severely delusional and dangerous. I told my father that I was leaving and asked if he was coming with me, and soon after he began divorce proceedings. One evening not long after, she completely lost control and began violently throwing my great-grandmother's china at him, not the durable everyday dishes, but the irreplaceable platinum-rimmed bone china. This was before most people could afford mobile phones, so my father ran to the house phone to call the police. She ran to the basement, and I immediately knew what she was going to do, so I positioned myself on the landing. Moments later, I saw the most terrifying thing of my life. My mother, her face twisted with rage and mania, holding a rifle and struggling to run up the stairs while trying to load it at the same time. I screamed that she had a gun, and my father and I ran out of the house through opposite doors, eventually huddling together in the woods in the rain until police arrived. People sometimes tell me I am an unusually calm person, but the truth is that once you have seen your own mother with a look of insanity on her face and a gun in her hands, about to kill your father and possibly you as well, very little else in life compares. Story 21. I have countless stories from the house I grew up in, which was without question haunted by a presence my childhood friend named Susie. I know many people are skeptical about ghosts, and my husband was too until he lived in that house with my parents and me for a year while we were still dating, after which he became a believer. The house is an old farmhouse, and we believe the spirit was a girl who once lived there, and she seemed especially intolerant of men, which is why my husband is now convinced. The time I was the most frightened happened one night when my parents' bedroom was about 10 feet down the hall from mine, with our doors facing each other. My dad worked nights, so my mom slept alone most evenings, and she was always the brave one when it came to Susie, never showing fear even when strange things happened. That night she came into my room and woke me up, asking if I had been watching television or talking on the phone, and it was somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning. I had been sound asleep and told her no, then heard her go upstairs to ask my brothers the same question, only to return to her room. Less than a minute later, she came back and asked me to sleep in her bed, which terrified me because she never reacted that way to anything in the house. She fell asleep almost immediately while I lay awake for at least half an hour, holding onto her arm just to feel safe. The next day I asked her what had happened, and she told me she had heard a sound coming from the dining room that reminded her of those children's toys where an arrow spins and lands on an animal while making noise. Except this one was speaking gibberish. She said it started quietly and kept getting louder and louder, which is why she went to check on us, even though she knew none of us were responsible. The moment she stepped out of her room, the sound stopped completely, and what made it more disturbing than anything else we experienced was how shaken it left my mother. Story 22. I was 16 when this happened and living with my parents. One morning I woke up and was getting ready for a friend to pick me up so we could meet our group for some event that I do not remember when my dad came into my room. He saw me getting ready and asked where I was going, and when I told him my plan, he asked me not to go. I scoffed and asked why, and he said he just wanted me to stay home that day. I had not looked at him until that moment because I was focused on getting ready, but I will never forget the expression on his face because I had never seen him look so scared and concerned at the same time. He did not blink, and something about that stopped me completely. I agreed to stay home. He nodded and he walked out. I had no idea what had just happened, but I texted my friend a random excuse, saying I could not go. Later, I went to find my dad and asked if everything was okay, and although he said he was fine, I could tell something was wrong. After some pushing, he finally told me what had happened the night before. He said he woke up in the middle of the night and saw me standing at the foot of his bed, smiling at him. He asked if everything was okay and turned over to go back to sleep, but when I did not answer, he turned back and watched as I slowly faded into the darkness. He rubbed his eyes and assumed he had been dreaming, but the feeling unsettled him, so he went to check on me. As he stepped into my room, he felt a cold chill run down his spine, watched me sleeping for a moment, and felt the same chill again as he stepped back out. The next morning, he woke up with a strong feeling that something bad was going to happen to me, which is why he asked me to stay home. Later that afternoon, I got a call from an unknown number, which turned out to be the mother of the friend who was supposed to pick me up. On the way to the event, he had been making a left turn when a truck ran a red light and crashed into the passenger side of his car, completely caving it in. My friend ended up in the hospital with a broken arm and a concussion, but survived, and he was alone in the car, which means I was not there with him. Story 23. I am certain that the house I grew up in was haunted, although my mom would get upset if I talked about it around my younger sister, who was already afraid to stay home alone even though she was 18. Each of us experienced strange things there, sometimes alone and sometimes together. One thing that happened to me repeatedly was something I never mentioned because I did not want to sound crazy. I am a very light sleeper, and when I wake up, I am fully awake, not in a half-dreaming state, which is how I knew this was real. In the middle of the night, I would hear a single note being played on our piano, and since most of my family members played, I assumed someone was downstairs. What made it strange was that it was always the same note, played over and over, echoing through the house. I even wondered if my dad was tuning the piano in the middle of the night. So I would sit up and listen, then walk to my door and look out, only to find everyone asleep while the note continued. This happened every few months. Another incident happened to my mom and sister when they were the only ones home. Our house had an open floor plan with a two-story living room, bedrooms on one side upstairs, and my sister's room and mine across a bridge. My mom was downstairs and my sister was in her room when they both heard footsteps. Neither of them wanted to panic, so they did not say anything at first, but when it happened again, my sister stepped onto the balcony and my mom looked up at her, and without saying a word, they both ran out of the house. A neighbor came over, and even she heard the same sound. Story 24. When my parents first moved into my childhood home, they set aside a room in the attic as a nursery for their first child, which ended up being me 2 years later. That room was always freezing cold, which was not surprising since the house was built in the late 1800s. But what was strange was that immediately after I was born and moved into the nursery, it became one of the warmest rooms in the house. As time went on, odd things started happening there, with wind-up music boxes slowing to a stop and then suddenly starting again on their own, and my parents hearing me giggle and move around at night as if I were playing with someone. Once I was old enough to talk in full sentences, my parents asked me who I was talking to at night, and I calmly told my mother that it was my old lady. When she looked confused, I asked her if she could not see the woman standing in my closet. She assumed it was just an imaginary friend, but as I got older, I began telling her that my old lady was sad and lost, and around that time the room became cold again. When I was 3 and my mom was pregnant with my younger brother, my grandmother, who followed paranormal television shows closely, suggested that children can sometimes see spirits, and that spirits who realize they are trapped become distressed, and that a child could help them by telling them to go toward the light. My family explained this to me, and according to them, I did just that. Years later, when I was home from college and alone in the house late at night, I stumbled across a website about haunted locations and searched my hometown for fun. One of the listings was my exact home address. The post described strange events from the 1970s and included a story about chasing an old woman from the attic to the basement and photographing her hiding behind a water heater. When I saw the attached photo, I had a panic attack because the woman in that picture was the same figure I had seen countless times in my childhood dreams and nightmares. Story 25. It was late at night during the summer, and I was 12 years old, alone in my room watching television. I started getting tired, so I turned everything off to go to sleep, but I kept hearing rustling sounds coming from the kitchen, which I assumed was my stepfather, since he was a night owl and often stayed up late. As I lay there, my mind started racing, and I began thinking about what I would do if it were actually an intruder, running through different scenarios, including grabbing a knife from the kitchen counter. I had used that knife earlier in the evening and knew exactly where I had left it. My thoughts were interrupted when I heard someone walking down the hallway toward my room. I quickly closed my eyes and pretended to be asleep as my door slowly opened. But I could not keep my eyes still, and when I looked, I saw a tall, lanky man at the foot of my bed leaning over me, resembling Ichabod Crane, extremely thin and at least 6 feet 5 inches tall. He reached a hand toward me, and I immediately jumped up and firmly told him to get out of my room. He became apologetic right away and claimed he was looking for a friend who used to live there. We were now standing in the hallway when he asked to use the restroom, which struck me as strange, but my first thought was my little sister sleeping in the next room, so I said yes and went to check on her, finding her still asleep. When I turned around, he was right behind me, but now his pants were undone. I walked straight to the kitchen, grabbed the same knife I had pictured earlier, pointed it at him, and loudly told him to leave the house immediately. He started shaking, apologizing repeatedly, and ran out the front door, which I locked behind him. Only then did the adrenaline and shock fully hit me, and it took a moment before I could wake my parents so we could call the police. The police dusted for fingerprints and determined that he had been watching me through the back window, and my room, which was the last one down the hallway, was the only one he had approached. The next day, I identified him from a book of offenders at the police station. I consider myself extremely lucky, and to this day, I still keep a knife by my bedside. Story 26. A roommate of mine had an ex-girlfriend whom he stayed in regular contact with because of their son, and although they were no longer together, they maintained a civil relationship and saw each other on weekends, since she lived a few hours away. He once told me a story about how she began feeling uneasy, like she was being watched whenever she went out, and especially when she came home. One night she returned late with their son asleep in his car seat, and as she got out of the car, she heard rustling in the bushes that sounded much larger than a cat or raccoon. She quickly grabbed her son and rushed inside her apartment, shaken but trying to calm down. Later that night, her car alarm went off, and despite knowing better, she went outside to check, finding the driver's side door wide open and the passenger seat fully reclined as if someone had been lying there. She locked the car and went back inside, deciding to leave it alone. A couple of nights later, at 3 in the morning, she heard a very soft, steady knocking at her door, quiet enough that no one else in the complex would hear it, and gentle enough not to wake her son, who was sleeping on the couch beside her. She slowly got up, went to the door, and looked through the peephole, where she saw a man dressed entirely in black, wearing a hood pulled over his head, and looking down at the floor while continuing to knock. She froze, terrified for herself and her child, and texted my roommate, asking if he was playing some kind of joke. But he was not, and immediately said he was on his way, though he was still about 30 minutes away. She sat on the couch and waited, never calling the police. After that, she stayed with her parents until she could find a new place to live, and with help from my roommate and her family, she moved out and has been fine since, with no more incidents. A few days later, my roommate texted me and said things had gotten even creepier, explaining that his young son had drawn a picture of that night. Both parents were extremely careful about what their son was exposed to, sending him to a Waldorf school and keeping him away from anything violent or frightening, and they had never told him what had happened. My roommate sent me a picture of the drawing, and to this day it still gives me chills, because his son said he drew it based on what he saw in a dream and how scared it made him, and both parents believe she narrowly avoided something truly terrible. Story 27. My mother and grandmother have told me about this event many times. When I was around 6 months old, my godfather was involved in a horrific accident at work, where he was crushed by heavy construction equipment while he was alone. His back was broken, and he lay there for hours before his father found him, dying. The night before the accident, he drove 2 hours from his hometown in the middle of the night just to visit my parents and me, and he kept saying goodbye to all of us, as if he somehow knew something terrible was going to happen. My mother found this deeply unsettling and could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. When our family received the news of his accident, it devastated everyone, especially my mother, since they had grown up together from childhood. My mother took me to his open casket funeral, and I touched his body there. In the weeks afterward, my behavior changed drastically as I became withdrawn, stopped eating and sleeping properly, and would mumble and laugh in the middle of the night, just like I did when my godfather used to play with me. My grandmother, who firmly believed in spirits, became convinced that his spirit had attached itself to me, so she inspected the house and performed a cleansing ritual on my room and my bed before leaving for the night. That same night, while my parents were asleep, the bedroom door suddenly slammed open, books flew off the shelves, and my godfather appeared standing near their doorway as a ghostly figure with no feet. My mother screamed at him, begging him to let me go and leave me alone, saying I was only a baby and that my health was getting worse, and he nodded in response before vanishing. Story 28. When I was about 12 years old, I had a blue furry nightlight in my room. One night I woke up and saw the silhouette of my mom standing there wearing the pajamas she always wore. I said her name, confused about why she was in my room, and I heard a startled sound as she suddenly ducked down in front of my bed, so I could not see her anymore. I got out of bed and looked under and around it, but no one was there. At the time, I was not scared, because my mom was very sweet and often did little secret things for me and my siblings, so I assumed I would ask her about it in the morning. The next day, I asked her why she had been sneaking around my room the night before, and she looked genuinely confused and told me she had no idea what I was talking about. I pressed her about it for several minutes, insisting that I had seen her and even heard her react when I noticed her, but she finally promised me she had not been in my room at all. That was when I became terrified, because I knew I had seen and heard something. A few years later, when I was around 16, I had rearranged my room, and my mom no longer owned that pajama set. I still used a nightlight, but it was much smaller and dimmer. One night I woke up again and saw the same silhouette wearing the same pajamas, and this time I knew for certain it was not my mother, so I hid under the covers, convinced that nothing could get me there. Story 29. I was around 10 to 12 years old when this happened, while I was on vacation with my family in the Caribbean. I was extremely skinny and weak-looking as a kid and had never really traveled before, so I had no street smarts at all. One night my family went on an evening boat ride, and by the time we returned to the dock it was around 10 or 11 at night, with no lights on and almost complete darkness. The island we were visiting was extremely impoverished, with many people living in rundown shacks and surviving on very little money. Wanting to be the first one back to the car, I ran far ahead of my family through the darkness, and as soon as I turned the corner into the parking lot, a man grabbed my arm tightly. I could barely see his face, but he started asking me who drove me there, and telling me that I was supposed to go with him and that he would drive me. He began pulling me toward a van, and just as I started to resist, the parking lot floodlights suddenly turned on. The man looked up in shock as my family came around the corner, immediately let go of me, and tried to act normal, though he was clearly panicked. That remains one of the creepiest experiences of my life, and I think about it often, especially realizing years later how dangerous the situation truly was and how differently things could have ended if my family had arrived even half a minute later. Story 30. I live in a relatively small town that happens to have two universities, one of which I attend. One night last year, I was out of the house with one of my roommates, while our other roommate, a girl, was home studying or sleeping. Around 11 in the evening, we got a call telling us to come home immediately. She explained that she had woken up to get some milk from the fridge when she looked over and saw a man trying to climb in through a window. At the time, we lived in an older house with those wooden lift-up windows, and many of them either had no screens or screens full of holes, making them mostly useless. Luckily, this particular window was in bad shape, and even with two people, we could only open it less than 6 inches. She told me that the only reason she even saw him, since all the lights were off, was because the refrigerator light came on when she opened it. She froze and they locked eyes as he slowly backed away while maintaining eye contact. She immediately ran upstairs, barricaded herself in my room, and called me. I ran home as fast as I could while calling several friends and the police. When I arrived, there were at least 6 cars outside our house at the same time, including 2 police cars. But the man was gone. The following week, a man was arrested in our town for breaking into a college girl's house while she was home alone and sexually assaulting her. It turned out my roommate was almost one of his victims, and she was not the first person he had targeted. Story 31. We rented the top 2 floors of a 2-family house that had previously belonged to an elderly woman who had passed away not long before, which was the reason the place was available. When I asked the neighbors if she had died in the house, they avoided the question. I had the attic to myself, which was great because it included 2 large bedrooms, one used as a living space, and a third mostly for storage. The problem was that there was a lot of unsettling old stuff left behind. Terrible flooring, old paint, and a 4th attic room that the landlord explicitly told us we were not allowed to use. The room connected to it was painted blood red, and inside there was a bed with crutches and a folded American flag on top, old fur coats, a wheelchair in the closet, and black and white photographs covering the walls. It was not a room you wanted to sleep near. Everyone who visited asked about it, and most of them said the attic felt haunted. After I fixed the floors and painted the walls, it became easier to forget how close that room was, but something about it still felt wrong, especially at night. To feel safer, I placed three 25-pound weights in front of the door and leaned a broom against it so I would hear it fall if the door moved. I am a light sleeper, so it gave me some comfort. One night, around 4 in the morning, I woke up to find all the weights moved across the floor about 4 feet, the door wide open, and the broom lying across the room. The feeling that hit me was pure dread. My stomach dropped. The hair on my arms stood up, and I ran out of the attic and could not sleep there for a long time. Eventually, I put a heavy dresser in front of the door, with weights on top of it, and never had another incident, but that night still haunts me. Story 32. This is something my grandmother told me, passed down partly from her grandmother and partly from her own experiences. She was born and raised in a very old house, so old that it was built with wooden pegs instead of metal nails. And during the Civil War, wounded Confederate soldiers were hidden and cared for in the attic. At one point, the family owned large cotton and cornfields and had slaves. According to my great-great-grandmother, there was a young boy who liked to play under the house and was considered a bit slow, so he was not trusted with much work. He would often be heard bouncing a small rubber ball against the underside of the house, which was raised on beams near a river. One day while playing, he began digging a hole under the house and, for reasons no one understood, buried his head in the dirt. At that moment, a heavy piece of wood fell from the underside of the house, trapping him. Unable to move it, he panicked and suffocated. Everyone else was working in the fields, so he was not missed until dinner, and when they finally searched, a dog kept whining and trying to lead someone under the house. He was eventually found and buried in the family plot. A few days later, the family began hearing the familiar thump of a ball bouncing under the house, and sometimes the ball would appear on the hearth in the living room, where the boy used to lie under the house near the chimney. Years later, not long before the house was condemned, I stayed there overnight with my grandmother during the winter. We had a fire going and were sitting quietly, her knitting and me reading, when we heard a steady thumping sound coming from behind a closed door that led to the stairs and up to the attic. My grandmother calmly opened the door, and a small red rubber ball rolled out across the room and stopped on the hearth. She told me not to touch it, closed the door, and went back to knitting. When I asked years later why the ball came from upstairs instead of under the house, she told me that in the winter, the boy liked to sit at the top of the stairs and bounce the ball down the steps. I have been uneasy around red rubber balls ever since. A few months later, the house was demolished and a new house was built farther from the river. I do not know if anything else ever happened there, but the land was eventually sold out of the family. Story 33. There is an urban legend about a man who wakes up in a hotel room ice bath missing a kidney, with instructions to call an ambulance. I believe I came very close to being kidnapped, but some background is needed first. A friend and I had opened a Minecraft server, and since I was older, I handled the money side of things. I was on a voice call with a kid who wanted to donate, and I told him to go to a mall and buy a prepaid card, but he said he could not do it until his parents got home. I asked why, since he was 15, not 5, and he told me that in his city, people had been going missing because of something called the Black Ambulance. I asked what that was, and he told me to look it up. I assumed he was making excuses to avoid paying and ended the call, then grabbed my bike and went out. A few minutes later, as I was about to turn onto my usual bike trail that led into the woods, I got an uneasy feeling and stopped at the junction, thinking maybe I had left the water running at home. As I turned around, I noticed something strange, a dark van with blacked-out windows coming out of the same trail I was about to enter and heading onto the road I was on. I did not think much of it, went home, and saw that the water was off. Since it was getting late, I abandoned the idea of going back out and instead searched for what that kid had mentioned. What I found on a news site terrified me. A picture of a nearly identical van with a headline warning people not to walk alone in remote areas because people had gone missing and been found dead. I looked out my window and saw the same van parked about 50 meters from my house. At that moment, I was so scared that I started crying. I locked the door, blocked it with a table and 3 chairs, and put a mattress between the window and the sofa. That night had such a huge impact on me that even now, thinking about it makes my eyes tear up. For over a month, I could not go to the bathroom at night without waking one of my parents, and I had nightmares for more than a year. I never found a fully documented case that confirmed the legend, but the idea that someone might have been waiting for me to be alone to kidnap me left me deeply paranoid. After that night, my greatest fear became other people.